Thank you very much. Real great pleasure to be here today. Having spent a long time writing a book on James Connolly, it's amazing to be in the same hall that he spoke on the 15th of September 1902. James Connolly came to the United States at the invitation of the Socialist Labour Party and planned to undertake an enormous lecture tour of the country. Daniel de Leon was the head of the SLP and had extended the invitation to Connolly. It suited both men very well. Connolly could investigate how socialism and unions were operating in the United States, and he could sell subscriptions to his newspaper, The Workers' Republic. For de Leon, having the renowned representative of the Irish working class on his side would ensure the loyalty of Irish-American socialists. Connolly, who was born into abject poverty in Edinburgh in Scotland in 1868, had a little schooling and joined the British Army at the age of 14, and for 7 years was stationed in the land of his parents, Ireland. Here he met his future wife, Lily Reynolds, married her in Scotland, and developed a healthy interest in the socialist movement through his brother John. Connolly was involved in a number of political parties and movements and was inclined towards speaking up for workers' rights at public meetings, to the extent that he was blackballed, as you say, in the States, and found it nearly impossible to get work. He decided at one stage to set up a small business in Edinburgh as a cobbler, fixing shoes, or as his brilliant advertisement stated, Connolly repairs the worn-out understandings of the brethren at the standard rates. The business was an abject failure. One comrade, Alice Munro, said she brought all of her family's shoes to Connolly for fixing, and that not one pair was wearable afterwards. A comrade asked Connolly how business was, and he commented that he was going to spend his last shilling on a shaving mirror and watch himself slowly starve to death. An appeal was made in 1896 in the radical newspaper Justice for work for Connolly, which was answered by the Dublin Socialist Club. Connolly moved his small family to Dublin and became the organiser of that club, but he basically disbanded it and founded the Irish Socialist Republican Party, which one Roy commentator in the media said had more syllables than members. Their membership card had the wonderful words which are inscribed on the Jim Larkin statue in Dublin. Some of you I met in Dublin recently. The words of the French revolutionary Camille Desmoulins, "The great appear great because we are on our knees, let us rise." And it was as a representative for the Irish Socialist Republican Party that Connolly was engaged by de Leon for the 1902 lecture. At the Cooper Union Hall on 15th September 1902, Connolly was recorded as saying, "No person can be economically free who is not politically free, and no person can be politically free who is not economically free." He then gave an account of the living conditions in Dublin and let the Irish Americans know that some of the shining lights of the Home Rule Executive Committee were in fact slum landlords. He often wrote home of his great experiences on the tour, but he found the heat of the country to be intolerable. In one particular letter to a comrade called Dan O'Brien, he wrote, "It is fearfully hot for me here, but the Americans say it is exceptionally cool. It is obvious to me that hell will be a far greater punishment to us than to the Americans. Another injustice to Ireland." Yeah. You see, Connolly, and it's often missed, he could be very witty. Murta Ling, one of his comrades, said he had a sledgehammer repartee. In one particular discussion in a place called Haverhill in Massachusetts, a listener kept interrupting him, and at one stage said to him, "You seem to know everything. Who will win the Derby?" And Connolly retorted, "A horse, but I'm surprised at an ass asking." he got into a fierce argument in Troy when they had him booked for 3 lectures. And he was very tired at this stage, so he refused and essentially went on strike and refused to do the 3 talks, which would have a huge bearing on him later on. He had an argument with a man called Frank Pisano, who was in the Socialist Labour Party in Troy, and this was something that would affect him later on in life when he moved to that, to that town, which a lot of you here will know is known as Collar City. After a 3.5-month lecture tour, Connolly gained a huge amount of subscriptions to the Workers' Republic. But when he returned to Ireland, an unfortunate row occurred over the mismanagement of the funds that he had sent from America. The comrades in Dublin had set up a small bar in the club and basically spent the money on drink. Connolly was justifiably angry at this, especially as he himself was teetotal. And a split occurred in the party, and he decided that eventually he would emigrate to the United States on a permanent basis. Excuse me. His return to the US in 1903 saw a bit of a cooling with his relationship with Dan DeLeon. Most likely as Connolly was no longer the representative of the IRSP, he was of little use to the head of the Socialist Labour Party. But Connolly luckily found work in Troy, including collecting dues for MetLife, that well-known bastion of socialism. And the following year, he was joined by the rest of his family. In 1904, Connolly had a letter printed in the Weekly People, the organ of the SLP, on wages, marriage and the church, in which he challenged the notion, quite prevalent among some unions and socialists in the US, that there was no point in arguing for higher wages, as that only resulted in price rises. Now, the letter irked Dan DeLeon, who was editor of the Weekly People, and he considered his views to be above argument. He was the interpreter of Marx. However, Connolly was correct. The iron law of wages was not true, as Connolly later argued that prices of goods rose first and that wages climbed slowly behind them. The point is that this letter drove a large wedge between Connolly and DeLeon. In 1905, Connolly got a job in the famous Singer factory, and the family moved to Newark. This, of course, is the same year, as John mentioned already, that saw the foundation of the Industrial Workers of the World in Chicago, the founders of which read as a Hall of Fame of the early 20th century organisers: Big Bill Haywood and Charles Moyer of the Western Federated Miners, Eugene Debs of the American Railway Union, Cork-born Mary Harris, better known as Mother Jones, who fought vigorously against the use of child labour, and Bill Troutman of the United Brewery Workers Union. Someone's a wobbly. Good on you. That's 2 of us. The Wobbly's motto, "An injury to one is an injury to all," would have attracted James Connolly, and he became involved with them a year after their foundation. A little story about a man called Frank Stenenberg, the anti-unionist former governor of Idaho, who was killed in a bomb attack in February 1906. And Moyer and Haywood were accused of the crime. Connolly ran the Newark Haywood-Moyer Defence Fund. Of course, you're all familiar with the facts of the case, as Albert Horsley was found guilty, and it transpired that the Pinkerton detective McParland had encouraged Horsley to say that Haywood had ordered him to do it. What it did show was the depths that the capitalists were willing to go to undermine radical unions. And it also exposed James Connolly to the IWW and to a greater audience. After he lost his job with Singer in 1907, he began to work in earnest on his tour de force, Labour in Irish History, which would eventually be published in 1910. In 1907, after Mayor George B. McLennan said, "There are Russian socialists, there are Jewish socialists, there are German socialists, but thank God there are no Irish socialists." Connolly's reaction to this statement was that he founded the Irish Socialist Federation and also the journal of that organisation, a very wonderful newspaper called The Harp. The Federation aligned itself with some of Connolly's old comrades. There was a bit of a thawing of the argument that went on there in the earlier days in 1902. The comrades now in Dublin were calling themselves the Irish Socialist Party. In July 1907, the IWW employed James Connolly as head organiser in New York. By December of that year, De Leon launched a bizarre attack on Connolly at a general SLP meeting with a debate on the criminal actions, as he called them, of James Connolly. They dragged up everything they could on him, his refusal to speak 3 times in Troy, and how he allegedly split the IRSP in Dublin. Around the same time, Connolly was bringing 10,000 Irish and Italian longshoremen into the Wobblies. De Leon claimed Connolly was a Jesuit agent trying to break up the labour movement by bringing so many Catholics into it. The charges were, of course, ridiculous, and Connolly won the day with the great support of the IWW, and De Leon was routed lock, stock and barrel. By April 1908, he had joined the Socialist Party of America, and indeed ended up lecturing for them and encouraging people to vote for Eugene Debs. I think it's fair to say that if Connolly was alive today now, he would rail against Donald Trump and his ignorant racist mantra designed to pit the working class against each other, and would truly have been a Bernie man. A collection of essays entitled Socialism Made Easy was published by a man called Charles H. Kerr in Chicago in 1909. That book, Socialism Made Easy, does exactly what it says on the cover. And one of the problems with socialist writers is they often try to make an interpretation of Marx much more difficult than it should be. And Connolly knew exactly who he should direct his words to, the working class for whom he was trying to emancipate. He got a check for $45, which, as far as I'm concerned, having written a fairly in-depth biography of him, was about the most money that he ever earned in one quick go. It also enabled him to undertake a major lecture tour of the United States on behalf of the Socialist Party. He went to Washington, Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, Iowa, Colorado, Texas, Arizona, Montana, and California. An 11-month tour, which is exhausting but amazing for him. All through that time, he kept in touch with Dublin until eventually an offer of a lecture tour secured his decision to return home. Again, he left his wife and children in New York, and in July 1910, he arrived home to Dublin. His old comrade, who used to write to Daniel O'Brien's mother, said he looked very well. He told her he managed to get something to eat while he was in America. Meanwhile in Ireland, Big Jim Larkin had founded the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And Connolly eventually became the Ulster organiser for the union and moved his whole family up to Belfast. His time in the US had matured him, and he learned a great deal about organising with the IWW. His time in the US had shown him how bosses exploit ethnic differences to divide workers. The same in Belfast, where workers were divided along religious grounds, often with deadly effect. Most of all, Connolly learned how important propaganda was to those who seek to organise. For the next 5 years, he would always ensure that he had his hand on the editorial pen of one newspaper or journal. When Connolly and James Larkin joined forces together to fight for union recognition against William Martin Murphy, Dublin's biggest employer, Connolly was the driving force behind the foundation of the greatest workers' defence force ever seen in Ireland, if not in the world. On the 31st of August 1913, Jim Larkin appeared in the window of the Imperial Hotel and spoke to the workers at an illegal gathering. The police ran in there and arrested Larkin and dragged him out on the streets. The famous Countess Markovitz shouted 3 cheers for Jim Larkin, and a policeman slapped her in the face, and all hell broke loose. The policemen came out of the side streets and gathered everybody together, kettling they call it, and bet the head off people. And in the weekend of violence, 3 people were murdered by the police. And that's why James Connolly and a man called Captain Jack White and Jim Larkin founded the Irish Citizen Army to defend the workers against the brutality of the police. A Galway art teacher by the name of McGahey eventually designed a wonderful flag for the Irish Citizen Army. I've seen a few of you with the badge on tonight. The starry plough, or the plough on the stars. The plough being the symbol of the dignity of physical labour, and the stars representing socialism, essentially. One of the wonderful aspects of the Citizen Army, or the ICA, is that women were allowed an equal role in the organisation. Countess Markievicz fought in that uniform in 1916 as second in command in Stephen's Green. A tremendous friend of James Connolly, whose house was always open to not only the Connolly family, but to an organisation that she run of Boy Scouts in Dublin called Na Fianna, or the Warriors. Dr. Kathleen Lynn of the Irish Citizen Army took over in City Hall when Sean Connolly and Sean O'Reilly were killed in action during the Rising. Rosie Hackett, who led 2 strikes in Jacob's Biscuit Factory and was given work as an organiser by Connolly when she was blackballed, fought in the uniform of the ICA during Easter week 1916. Rosie was involved in the Irish Women Workers Union with the Abbey actor Helena Maloney, and they also fought together in the ICA. There's a picture up there of Delia Larkin, one of the main founders of the Irish Women Workers Union. You can see just at the door on the right-hand side. And incidentally, Rosie Hackett has a new bridge over the Liffey named in her honour. It's one bridge out of 24 over the River Liffey, the rest named after men, but nonetheless, it is a start. I was there the day the bridge was opened, and they had a podium set up, and from the podium the talk was how brilliant it was that finally women's role in the revolution is being recognised. And this beautiful little old Dublin woman pulling one of those trolleys full of her shopping behind her stumbled upon the event, and when there was a silence in the proceedings, shouted up, "How come there's no women on that podium?" And sure enough, it was 3 men who launched the bridge. There's no recovery after that, is there? One of my favourite women from that period is a Glaswegian from Glasgow, obviously, in case you don't know, in Scotland. Margaret Skinner is her name. She left her job as a maths teacher, and with her final cheque, she bought a Lee Enfield rifle. All teachers dream of doing the same with their final cheque. And she made her way to Dublin and lived with Countess Markievicz. And on the morning of the Rising, herself and 9 women were to be picked up and brought to Eamon de Valera's position with the 3rd Battalion in Boland's Bakery and Boland's Mills. However, nobody came for the women, so instead they fought up in Stephen's Green. Margaret was wounded 3 times during the uprising, throwing a bomb into the Russell Hotel to try and burn a sniper out. He retorted by shooting her 3 times. And years later, she said to Eamon de Valera, "How come you left us women standing there? Why didn't you bring us down to Boland's?" And de Valera says, "With hindsight, I should have brought all the women because it would have freed up my men from the cooking duties." So you can imagine her reaction to that. If Connolly was a socialist and trades unionist who became a revolutionary, tonight, as you've already heard, we also remember a man who was a revolutionary first, and then in his later life, a trades unionist and a communist. Mike Quill, who fought with the IRA and admired James Connolly so much, as John said, that he named his own union in honour of Larkin and Connolly's Transport Workers Union. On a visit to Dublin during 1938, Quill outlined what he believed was the key lesson of his American experience. Seeing how the transit employers exploited religious and racial divisions, Quill concluded that if we, black and white, Catholic and non-Catholic, Jew and Gentile are good enough to slave and sweat together, then we are good enough to unite and fight together. Our common cause, back in the early 20th century, as much as it is now, workers of America, Ireland, and indeed the world need to organise or die. And many men and women died as organisers, be they Joe Hill or James Connolly or Mike Quill. Their legacy is that the strength and courage of their conviction still shines a guiding light for workers everywhere. Thank you very much.